All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us for another edition of our Research at Home webinar series hosted by the Vice President for Research and Partnerships Office. The presentation will last approximately 40 to 45 minutes today, and then there'll be a question and answer session at the end. Feel free to submit your questions via the Q&A box at the bottom, or during the question and answer session, you can raise your hand and we can ask your question out loud. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Moon.
Hi, everybody. I'm happy to be able to bring you this talk today. The Department of History of Science, Technology, and Medicine is co-sponsoring this talk with the VPR's office. And we are delighted to welcome Dr. Tolu Odumosu to give us a talk today. He is a science, technology, and society scholar who studies technological systems, but thinks of them, as their historically and culturally situated socio-technical systems. His first book was Cycles of Invention and Discovery, was published by Harvard University Press in 2016, and he's going to give us, he's going to tell us some of the findings from that work today. He holds a PhD in Science and Technology Studies from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, as well as a master's degree in electrical engineering from Cornell University, and a bachelor's degree in electrical and electronic engineering from the University of Lagos. He was an associate in the Science, Technology, and Public Policy program at Harvard University's prestigious Kennedy School, and he's currently a visiting associate professor at James Madison University. Dr. Odumosu's dual training in engineering and social sciences gives him unique perspectives on the joint social and technical character of modern, complex technological infrastructures, and those valuable insights in turn are really critical for helping to formulate smart technology policies. He is currently developing a book on mobile telephony systems in Nigeria. So a warm welcome to Dr. Odumosu.
Thank you, Dr. Moon. Thank you. So let me share my screen and I will begin the presentation. Okay, I hope you can all see the presentation. Yes. So thank you all very much for the opportunity to present on my work. I am delighted to be here. And even through the virtual omnipresence of Zoom, I hope and I look forward to a robust conversation. I want to begin by acknowledging the times in which we're all living. Here in the United States, we're particularly privileged to have access to vaccines, and it appears that there is some light at the end of the tunnel. However, in other countries, this is not the case. And I want to acknowledge in particular the pain and suffering of people in Brazil and in India. And if you are on this Zoom call and you have family or loved ones in a country that's dealing with the worst of this pandemic, my thoughts are with you this afternoon. Times of change are also times of renewal. Times of crisis, also times of change and renewal. About 75 years before the current pandemic, the world slowly emerged from a different crisis. In the aftermath of World War II, the United States made a number of decisions that resulted in the current federal-funded research ecosystem that we live within today. One of the most important decisions at that time was to adopt an understanding of research that resonated with the linear model that intimates that invention proceeds from basic research all the way through applied research through the warm embrace of the invisible hand of the free market. What is clear is that there was an inflection point after the war when Roosevelt was interested in institutionalizing federal sponsored research. Had he turned to someone other than Vannevar Bush, US science and technology policy could have been very different than what it is today. And given that, globally speaking, most of the rest of the world, most of the planet has emulated the United States in the way the world understands how research priorities should be funded, the decision that was taken at that particular moment really had global impact. In other words, the dichotomy of basic and applied research has taken on the mantle of becoming a public fact. So let me just talk about what I'm calling public facts for a few minutes. After the end of World War II, Roosevelt was interested in preserving the great scientific and technological efforts of the war and in turning them towards peacetime activities. He hoped that the efforts that had helped stop fascism could now be harnessed to improve the national health, create new enterprises, create new jobs, and in his words, ensure the betterment of the national standard of living. Roosevelt wrote to Vannevar Bush, who was at that time the director of the Office of Scientific Research and Development, OSRD, asking for his recommendations on how to move OSRD from a wartime footing to a focus on peacetime goals. Bush made recommendations that really undergird the way we understand research today, and his recommendations led to our current understanding of research as being divided into basic and applied. In a similar vein, the COVID-19 pandemic has caused the idea of social distancing to take on the weight of a public fact, by which I mean an idea that enjoys widespread support and shapes public policy and thinking. Just as the public fact of research being understood as two moves of basic and applied, even in the face of opposition by practitioners of research, social distancing is here to stay, even though medical professionals, sociologists, and public health officials acknowledge that the term is problematic. Both of these things have become public facts. So Bush's report in response to Roosevelt's letter that Roosevelt had written to him asking him for recommendations was very comprehensive. The report, known as Science, the Endless Frontier, can be summed up as arguing that the best way to accomplish increased industrial research activity would be to increase the flow of scientific research through the support of basic research and to aid in the development of scientific talent. So Science, the Endless Frontier was completed in July 1945, a few months after Roosevelt had died in office. And over the next few years, Truman, who succeeded Roosevelt, implemented a number of the ideas contained in Science, the Endless Frontier, and it became foundational to how federal policy around research was organized. And what it did was enshrine this notion that there was a fundamental divide in research between basic and applied. And it set the parameters of the debate around federal funding of science and technology through the rest of the 20th century and into the present. Bush's ideas about the relationship between basic and applied research were probably shaped by his experience of managing OSRD during the war. And though he didn't invent the terms, and he was not the first person to divide research into basic and applied, or even use terms like pure or fundamental, the influential nature of his report ensured that these terms became widespread in their adoption, and they became siloed in the federal government. So on this particular slide, I have the Department of Defense's website on basic research, and it's very clear just how dominant Bush is. The Vannevar Bush Faculty Fellowship is prominent there. There's a direct quote from Science, the Endless Frontier, and the quote reads, "Basic research leads to new knowledge. It provides scientific capital. It creates the fund from which the practical applications of knowledge must be drawn." Emphasis on must. New products and new processes did not appear full grown. They founded on new principles and new conceptions, which in turn are painstakingly developed by research in the purest realms of science. No mention of engineering whatsoever. So Bush's work earlier on with Roosevelt and then on with Truman led to the Public Law 507 enacted by the 81st Congress, or also known as the act that created the National Science Foundation. And if you look at section 3A1, which I have here, it's that the foundation is authorized and directed to develop and encourage the pursuit of a national policy for the promotion of basic research and education in the sciences. So here we see one of the very first instantiations of this idea that basic research was the primary focus, not just of the NSF, but is defined in a way that distinguishes it from applied research. So this act was approved only 5 years after Bush's report was completed. And for our purposes, it really helped define this notion of basic research in the federal government. On the other hand, we also have social distancing. And I think it's good to think through how things become public facts. And if we remember at the start of the pandemic, it quickly became clear that this idea of social distancing was one that was promoted to the public. As you know, we all have to practice social distance. It's connected to hygiene and health. And almost immediately, there were reactions or responses to social distancing being problematic. Here is an article that was published on CNN, an opinion piece written by 3 sociologists, and they're basically arguing that we shouldn't call it social distancing. The social distancing is problematic because what we really need in the pandemic is actually increased social ties and physical distancing. So they propose it should be called physical distancing. And this was published in March 21, 2020. Here is another piece that was published, I believe, in Germany a little earlier in the year, January 24, 2021. They're still arguing that social distancing is problematic, and they're arguing in the field of public health for a change in the terminology that we use. And here is the final article from the Canadian Journal of Public Health that is encouraging us to practice physical separation. And the reason I bring up social distancing is because I think very much like basic and applied, what you see is the actual practitioners or experts arguing that the terminology is problematic and inimical to the work they're trying to do, but that it is somewhat of a zombie. It just cannot be killed. It keeps existing. And I think part of the reason, at least when it comes to basic and applied, is the institutionalization of these ideas in federal research infrastructure. And I think that most people on this call can appreciate the need to reinforce social ties during the pandemic. The problems that basic and applied research wreak are not always fully appreciated. So I just want to examine the problem of basic and applied research in a bit more detail. So I would like to invite you to come with me back to February 25, 2015 to Washington, D.C., Capitol Hill, where we will all be attending a meeting of the House of Representatives that is just getting started. And up for questioning is the Defense Secretary, Ernest Moniz, and he is attempting to defend the Obama 2016 budget for the Department of Energy. And he has taken over this position from the well-known physicist and Nobel Prize winner, Stephen Chu. Moniz is a nuclear physicist and professor of physics and engineering systems at MIT. And as the committee questions him about the budget proposal, I want you to pay attention to the differences in conceptualizations of research that the congressmen, and they're only men, use versus the way in which Moniz thinks about the work of the Department of Energy.
The Committee on Science, Space, and Technology will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recesses of the committee at any time, and we welcome you all to this hearing. The subject of the hearing is an overview of the Department of Energy's budget proposal for fiscal year 2016.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, the federal government is currently facing an extreme budget constraint. In light of the current budgetary crisis, how should we prioritize energy research and development activities to maximize the impact on technology development and the overall energy system?
Well, again, clearly, our administration request, we think, does reflect an appropriate set of priorities. We do.
Yes, so Secretary Muniz has an extended response that I sort of sped up so that we can keep this to an appreciable time. But I just wanted you to note the question about budget priorities, and I will play a continuation of this conversation.
Though, please compare and contrast the value of basic and early stage foundational research to late stage deployment and commercialization activities.
Well, we think we have to work across the entire innovation chain because we are looking at the introduction of these new technologies at different timescales. Some like in this decade, some in the next 10, 20 years, and then some way down the road, some of the nuclear things I just mentioned, for example, way down the road. So those require work at different parts of the innovation chain. So we have everything from, let's say, energy frontier research centers, which we think is an incredibly successful program on the basic research side for the enabling science for new energy technologies of the future, all the way to things like our loan program, which are on the deployment side, which, by the way, is a program that's actually in the black and has really stimulated technology deployment that's pushing the technology envelope.
Okay, well, the budget requests a 42.3% increase in the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy. That's over $800 billion in new spending. This is an enormous increase in an office that focuses on late-stage commercial applications, not basic research at universities and national labs. By contrast, the budget for the Office of Science, which funds basic research, increases by only 5.4% in the budget request. Are the Office of Science's basic research programs a lower priority for this administration when compared with these renewable programs?
So that's a good question. And I want you for a minute to put aside the politics of the Democratic administration's priorities being contested by Republican lawmakers. But the question that he asks there is basically stating in form of a critique that why is the administration prioritizing late-stage commercialization programs over basic research? Why is it asking for more money for those programs over basic research? And he's asking, are you prioritizing basic research over, which is more important? Sorry, prioritizing applied research over basic research, whereas, for the purposes of the question, basic research is seen as the more important, more fundamental thing that Congress should really be funding, because of course, the applied stuff leads to commercialization, and that is the responsibility of the market. And let's listen to Muniz's response.
Okay, the gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Holtman.
Thank you, Chairman. Government-wide, I'm glad the president's budget does increase R&D, but I still see it as a problem that has been ongoing with this administration's choice to value applied R&D over basic scientific research. Why does the president's budget propose a 5% increase to applied R&D while only giving a 3.5% increase to basic research?
Again, Representative Hall-Green rephrases the same question that the committee is pushing to get Secretary Muniz to respond, which is, as far as they're concerned, the money should really be spent on basic research, not applied R&D. So what's going on here? I propose that we think about this as a clash of mental models, as a clash of ways that these two groups are thinking about and processing what research is. On one side, the members of Congress are thinking about research as basic or pure, and applied research, even though it's important, is not really what Congress should be funding. And the practitioner model, Secretary Muniz talks about the entire innovation chain. So he isn't thinking about research as split up into these different categories, but that each particular part of the innovation chain is necessary for other parts, especially given the work that DOE is trying to do. On one hand, you can think of it as a binary research that should be funded or not funded versus a continuum which is research that may have impact in the world and therefore needs to be understood as a whole, as a holistic, one needs to have a holistic view. So why does this view matter? So if we stay with the Department of Energy to address this question of why this matters, one important reason is that one of the primary problems that the Department of Energy seeks to address in its research is the problem of energy use in a resource-constrained world, where the environmental cost of fossil fuels is very high. Under Stephen Chu's leadership, the Department of Energy began 2 programs to address the multidisciplinary problem of creating solutions to future energy requirements: the Energy Frontiers Research Centers and the Energy Innovation Hubs. The thinking at that time was that the Energy Frontier Research Centers, the FRCs, would more closely align with universities and national laboratories, whereas the Energy Innovation Hubs would be closer to the national laboratories and industry. The hope was that this arrangement would bridge a number of identified divides that the DOE itself had identified and promote interdisciplinary teams with the necessary expertise to create the needed future energy technologies and move them to market. Both EFRCs and EIH, or both Energy Frontiers Research Centers and Energy Innovation Hubs, were multidisciplinary institutions. They engaged a diverse range of expertise and were explicitly designed to move between theory and practice while focused on future technologies. So, what could go wrong, right? What could possibly prevent them from achieving their potential? So in the course of conducting research for the book, I spoke with a number of people who were involved in the review teams that gave feedback on the running of the Energy Frontiers Research Center. And what I discovered was rather shocking. And while it was clear that the centers were doing excellent work in material science and engineering and making great strides in understanding the physics and the chemistry of the various projects, there was a clear and demonstrable widespread reluctance to actually build devices to prototype their ideas. Repeatedly, the EFRC directors argued that they could not build prototypes because to do so would mean that they were no longer doing science. As the EFRCs are funded by the Office of Science in the Department of Energy, the directors concluded that they could not be found to be doing work that was too applied. So from the congressional testimony, you can clearly see why these researchers felt the need to police the boundary between science and stuff that's applied, and to ensure that one type of research didn't cross over into another. So one way to think about this is a tension between practice and structure. So the researchers, of course, it would have been helpful, needful, if they weren't getting money from DOE, they would have built prototypes of the work that we're doing. But they were very, very careful and needlessly so to do that because they didn't want to go over that border. And so we can see that the structure of basic versus applied that the federal government promulgates actually constrains the practice of research. So why are we where we are today? So one of the very many ironies of this story is that Bush himself was an engineer and Dean of Engineering at MIT, but in his report, he used the term science 120 times, science the endless frontier, that's report I'm referring to, and engineering only 4 times. His view was that basic research is research without thought of practical ends. Again, you see here that, look, if you're going to build prototypes, then clearly you're not doing basic research. And it must be protected from applied research, lest basic research become corrupted to its less pure form. And basic research is the pacemaker of technological progress. Applied research is research that's focused on solving practical problems, and therefore that border needs to be policed so that basic research can be protected and can flourish. So much has been said about why Bush took the positions he did. And as I explore in the book, there were many interventions in the war that he participated in as the head of USRD that were clearly the product of an integrative research approach. And those things brought together academia and industry in productive ways. And Bush was well aware of them. Yet, as a Ronald Klein, historian of technology, reports, he consistently went out of his way to describe all the engineers working in the Office of Scientific Research and Development as scientists in order to counter what he saw as the American military's antipathy towards engineering salesmanship and British snobbery towards engineering. In other words, class consciousness and desire to not be perceived as inferior to the Brits led Bush to downplay his own plebeian engineering roots and venerate science so much that you'd be hard pressed to find engineering mentioned anywhere in his highly influential report. We must bear in mind, though, that at that time in history, the war had just ended, the nation was moving towards a peace footing. Science was in the ascendancy. The bomb which brought the war to an end, and the physicists who were essential to inventing that bomb were kings. The age of engineering, which I contend that we're living in right now, had not yet arrived. Household names were Oppenheimer, Teller, and Fermi, not Gates, Zuckerberg, and Musk. Maybe if Bush were writing that report now, he would have made different decisions. But the impact of his choices were so profound that Google actually documents their effect on the corpus of English. And you can see here, this is a Google Words tracker. From the 1940s, the terms basic and applied sort of just took up and became the dominant usage when applied to science, whereas terms like applied science, pure research, industrial research, engineering science, either declined or stayed pretty low in their usage. So what would have happened if Bush had made different decisions when he wrote Science: The Endless Frontier that became the basis upon which the NSF was designed and the law that brought the NSF into being, and in many ways shapes federal R&D research policy today, as you can see from my example of the Department of Defense and the discussion of how the Department of Energy runs its particular research programs. So Bush's view of research was not the only model that the 1940s has to offer us. There are other alternative visions of research that are more promising and reflect the lived experience of researchers. I'm of course referring to the great industrial research laboratories, of which Bell Labs is perhaps the best known. So what would an alternative vision look like? In the standard vision with which we are living with, basic research is performed without thought of practical ends. It results in general knowledge and an understanding of its nature and its laws, whereas applied research provides answers to important practical problems. So my co-author and I, Venki Naranamurthy, and I have promoted this idea that we should think about research instead as a cycle between discovery and invention. And this view is not only integrative, but it's also driven by a grounds-up approach. It's driven by paying attention to what researchers actually do in laboratories, how they think about their work, how they move between theory and practice. And we can think of research then as having two cycles: a cycle of invention, which is the accumulation and creation of knowledge that results in new tools, devices, or processes that accomplish particular specific purposes, and discovery, the creation of new knowledge and facts about the world. So research is always moving between these two, discovery and invention, in our model. And of course, the prime example is Bell Laboratories, one of the places that we go into quite a bit of detail in the book. And here I have an image from left to right of Bardeen, Shockley, and Brattain in Bell Labs, where the world's first transistor was developed in 1947. Dr. Moon mentioned that my first degree is in electrical and electronics engineering, and I also have a master's in electrical and computer engineering. And one of the things that really fascinated me in my work as an engineer has been telecommunication systems. And of course, one can't really talk about telecommunications and its ability to transfigure the world, and of course, with the invention of the mobile telephone, without talking about the transistor. The transistor is one of the forerunners of our modern communications era. So one of the things that we do in the book is we take this model of discovery and invention and we apply it to a number of Nobel Prizes to see if we can map out the ways in which these Nobel Prizes represent the flow between discovery and invention. And here on this particular graph, or I have in the image, let me see if I can get a pointer up and running. Yes. The 1956 Nobel, which was given for the discovery of the transistor, even though, of course, that happened in 1947 and 1948. And the transistor directly led to the invention of fiber optics. Without fiber optics, there is no way we would have modern telecommunications. And invention, the transistor itself is unique because it sits right on the line between invention and discovery. The transistor was both an invention and a discovery. One thing that we noticed reading through the Nobel citations is that the Nobel Prize itself in the 40s, 50s, 60s, all the way through to, I think, the 2000s, privileged discovery more than invention. So the Nobel Prize, a 1956 Nobel Prize for the transistor, it wasn't actually given for the transistor. It was given for the discovery of the transistor effect and the invention of the bipolar junction transistor, which is what Shockley was involved with. So it was discovery of the transistor effect and the invention of the bipolar junction transistor. So it's both an invention and a discovery. And the 2009 Nobel was the invention of the fiber optic waveguide. That also influenced the invention of the charge coupled device. The 1956 Nobel, you don't get CCDs without transistors. And CCDs also, transistors were also essential, and the transistor effect were also essential to the discovery of the quantized Hall effect and the discovery of a new form of quantum fluid in 1998. And these discoveries and inventions together were necessary for the discovery and invention of the laser. And of course, the laser is necessary for thinking through or the discoveries in quantum electronics that led to the invention of the mason, the laser, are necessary for the way in which we moved from transistors to integrated circuits, because understanding quantum effects is essential for trying to put together a circuit that's integrated. So what we propose as an alternative to the sharp dichotomy of basic research and applied research is this discovery and invention cycle where ideas and devices inform one another, and one can start from an idea and move to a device, or start from a device and move to an idea. And a classic example, I think, is the CCD. The CCD, when you read about the invention of the CCD, it was directly influenced and an adoption of the work that was done in transistors. And another example, of course, is the invention of the integrated circuit, which was directly influenced and in many ways challenged by not just the work on transistors, but also by the work on quantum electronics. So there are many inventions and discoveries at Bell. Here I just list a few. We go through a number of them in the book and talk about how they can be understood with this new integrative model of research as a cycle rather than research as linear or line when one thinks about the linear model. And I want to emphasize that one of the things that became clear to us pretty quickly was that the culture of Bell Labs was highly essential to creating the space for this kind of activity. And some of the things that were essential of that culture were a collaboration being the primary mode of interaction, and how peers intensely interacted, and the administrative leadership came from within, a term that we started employing, looking at not just Bell Labs, but also at Geneva Research Labs and at a couple of university institutions that were modeled in Bell, was this notion of egalitarian meritocracy. So where should we draw the line, thinking about implications of the new model? And we still think there is a line to be drawn between research and development. And we understand research as an unscheduled activity, unscheduled quest for new knowledge. And by unscheduled, what that means is the timeframes are pretty far out. And the creation of new inventions whose outcomes cannot be predicted in advance and in which both science and engineering are essential ingredients. Whereas development has a schedule. You're building an iPad or you're building an iPhone and you need to get it to market with a well-defined outcome and a specified time frame that is aimed at the marketplace. And we think that is perhaps the more useful distinction to make. So the goal of the book, of course, was to change the world. And an important question is how far have we come in our goal to change the world? And I listened very closely to President Biden's speech to both houses of Congress. And according to this transcript, he did not once use the term basic research, but instead deployed the language of research and development. Perhaps the president has read my book. This is the change that we need at the level of presidential language. But for real change, this nuanced understanding of research must also be adopted by the federal bureaucracy, and that is a long struggle ahead to change the world. I have just a few minutes left, so I'm going to move quickly. In conclusion, one way to think about science and technology policy as is currently constituted is thinking about it as an inscription device, and the basic applied research framework as something that travels very easily but is immutable in the way that it's understood. And I think that's pretty clear from the ways in which multiple countries around the planet have adopted this dichotomy of basic and applied research in the way they organize their own research funding systems. So the framework draws together things in ways that can be counterproductive and destructive to the pursuit of science and engineering, as exemplified by the review of the FRCs. When I was conducting my research for the book, I also spoke to faculty members and professors who, when we're writing grants for the NSF, needed to do that dance between how you describe something in ways in which you make sure that what you're describing is basic research, but when you're actually doing the research, you're not paying attention to those distinctions and you're just doing what you need to get work done. But in your reporting, you reimpose that same frame. And the boundary work that the basic and applied framework relies upon is actually inimical to science and technology and the development of science and technology. And it's time to make a change. Just in the same way, we may have missed the boat on getting rid of social distancing. But I don't think that as hopefully as the pandemic comes to an end and we no longer need to think about things like social distancing, it's perhaps time to rethink how we think about research and move away from basic and applied to more integrative models. So I will stop there because it's 1:40, and I just want to say thank you, and I'm open for questions.
We received 2 questions in the question and answer box, so I can read those to you. But also I wanted to remind everybody, if you want to ask your question, you can submit it via the Q&A box, or you can raise your hand and we can call on you. But the first question is from Joshua Emerson. He said, is there such a thing as a return on investment for government investment in research? If so, how is this calculated or measured? And he continues, I can imagine that not all research has the same value, but perhaps the future value can't be known at the time the research in question is funded.
That's a wonderful question. I am not sure if I'd have to talk to research economists to see how the ROI on government research is calculated. I know it certainly has rhetorical value. Listening to President Biden speak a few days ago, he invoked time and time again DARPA and talked about how DARPA, of course, the work in the DARPA undertook influenced everything from the internet as we know it today to microwaves. And I'm not sure, what value one would place in the internet, either at the federal level or even, I think, at the global level. and some of the protocols and technologies that have come out of the internet. So I think the way that public research is usually conceptualized as functioning is nationalizing costs that have broad public benefit, but to actually calculate that benefit in a dollar value would be rather difficult. And I'm not aware of work that has tried to do that. I think that broadly speaking, R&D expenditures are known at a national level, and maybe connecting that to GDP and growth in GDP is one way to perhaps get a sense of the impact, but I'm not sure how one would break that up into particular timeframes for devices, products, or systems that come out of federal investment in R&D.
We have a hand raised by Hunter. I'm going to go ahead and call on him and allow him to ask his question out loud. Oh, maybe he put his hand back down.
Unmute. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Hi,
Okay,
Hunter.
all right. Sorry, my unmute disappeared on me. Thank you for a really interesting talk. I was wondering, you had mentioned briefly the sort of the political valence, and sort of set aside this is Democrats versus Republicans in that hearing for a moment. But I was wondering if you could actually talk a little bit about the politics of this, because Bush in many ways was quite a conservative. To what extent are some of these assumptions and designations about basic versus applied connected, in a sense, to a conception of the proper role of government in sort of opposing industrial policy, but that's more of a liberal goal, but and trying to leave sort of invention and marketing to sort of a free market, but realizing that the free market's not going to pay for basic research, and thus must be there. That there's a political philosophy in there, which is interestingly sort of flipped by the time you get to the 21st century, with the conservatives saying, "Well, we should definitely pay for the basic research." Again, so that's question is, to what extent have the political values played a role in this, and have they changed, or is this a continuing division?
Thank you, Hunter. That's a great question. So I think the way I think about it is really to see it as a continuation of the war, the mobilization that the war effort engendered, and the ways in which the state had to, in many ways, engage industrial research laboratories around the country directly into the war effort. And that particular mobilization led to an explosion in PhD programs and in funding for PhDs, especially in physics. And it was very clear that, at least I think from my reading of Bush, that he didn't want that to end. And I think Roosevelt was positively, felt positively about that idea that the state had gotten into a position where it was channeling significant resources into areas that seemed to be of benefit. And so I think in terms of Bush's conservatism, we do address some of that in the book, but I suspect it was really a question of preserving the status quo of the war effort and ensuring that those funds weren't diverted. And so, yeah, there's certainly a sense of, preserving the status quo as much as that is a conservative goal. To your other question about how that plays into the proper role of the state and how it's become a Republican position that the state, has responsibility to fund that kind of research. I mean, I think that would perhaps tie that to shifts in how the state has funded not only NSF, but also some of the other research programs that federal dollars began to be tied to. And I think the clear benefit of some of those programs to not just the war effort, because that was over, but tied to national defense. And I really think that that's where the connections resonate with conservatives. That this is really a question of national, of preserving the nation and preserving national defense. And I mean, even if we look at budget dollar allocations, DoD research allocations are immense, even compared to what NSF gets. So I suspect that is really where, especially when you look at how DoD itself thinks about basic research. I mean, DoD's conceptualization of this basic and applied dichotomy is perhaps the strongest. I mean, even compared to DOE, which has actually done quite a bit of work to think in an integrative way. So yes, I think the connection to national defense and to military funding, we can't ignore that when we think about ways in which this has become taken up as a conservative bulwark.
Okay, thank you, Hunter. And we have some more written questions. Do the next one. Does your new model challenge the definition of technology as applied science? Within your more, excuse me, cyclical frame, could we also define science in terms of technology? Sorry, I apologize for that.
Oh no, that's great. Thank you. Does the model move away from technology as applied science? Yes, it does. Without getting into a lot of detail in what's in the book, because I would encourage you to read the book. One of the things that we were very interested in was the ways in which the boundaries of what is science and what is technology get reinscribed in the practice of different scientists and technologists. So for example, engineers who I think are widely seen as technology people have won Nobel Prizes, and scientists have won the prize of the National Academy of Engineering. So, and because in the book we're focused on research, it's became very clear to us as we spoke to practitioners and people who were working in research labs that engineering research and quote unquote scientific research, and I'm thinking now about the more engineering sciences like physics, the crossover was very, very broad. And the amount of boundary work that was going on was actually rather minimal when it came to the nature of the activities themselves and the things that folks were interested in. There were other kinds of boundaries that were being reinscribed. For example, the boundary between theoreticians and folks who are experimentalists. But the boundary between technology and science was one that was clearly always being not necessarily being focused on, because in the actual practice of their work, it was always being challenged and not necessarily seen as a fixed object that needed to always be navigated against. So yeah, I am, in the book, we do spend quite a bit of time talking about science and technology and how those particular terms, the meanings have shifted over time, but also how the research community itself thinks about the work they do, either as engineering or science.
All right, our next question. Apart from answering specific questions, how did the engineers and/or scientists you interviewed respond to your project? What did they think of it?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. So I interviewed engineers and scientists in national research labs, in university research labs, and in industrial research labs. And by and large, at that particular point, I mean, I don't think we had fully thought through our conclusions when the interviews were conducted, but from folks to whom, we sent copies of the book, and the responses that we've gotten so far have all been wonderfully encouraging. And in many ways, they have applauded the ways in which we captured the reality of the research experience that they themselves undertake, and the sorts of questions about culture and administration and institutionalization that we raise in the book, and how those play into research as a process. So the response has been very positive overall.
Great. Next question is, how is jargon affected by the paradigms?
That is a wonderful question. I think some of these paradigms are fundamental. So the basic / versus applied is, and that gets taken up and, reimagined in different ways, like, basic applied research. So if you want to talk about jargons, it does become jargony when folks are trying to navigate where one ends and the other begins. But I think it gets institutionalized in the way, for example, DoD's activities get carried out. And if you look at the ways that DoD organizes its research activities and the ways that these activities get funded, the impact it has is on trying to preserve the boundaries between particular kinds of activities. So it isn't necessarily just a question of jargon, as it becomes a question of preserving boundaries. And in preserving those boundaries, it leads to isolating research activities in ways that are not productive of research crossing the lines that it needs to. In fact, those lines don't even need to be there when researchers are actually trying to get the work that they're meant to do, get them done. I think I gave an example from the DOE and the reluctance to build devices because they didn't want to be seen as doing work that wasn't basic research.
All right, next question. Given the history of US companies fighting the chip wars of the 80s and 90s with Japan and South Korea, and the recent resurfacing of this type of techno-industrial warfare with China, do you think that the general attitude towards innovation in the US is evolving for better or worse?
Fascinating question. Well, one of the things I think is an important development, and this did come up in the president's speech, is the idea that research and development, and to an extent we explore this in the book, even though one draws a line between research and development, that line is never a hard one. And the reason this is important is because, as you point out, and the chip wars, I think, are a great illustration of this. It has become increasingly clear that having your fabrication facilities not located in the same place as you have your design and research facilities is actually inimical to moving forward or even breakthroughs in chip design and chip research. And so I think the shift in the United States towards thinking about the need to bring fabrication with research, bring those two parts of the organization closer together, is actually a helpful one for making the distance between research and development much smaller. So I think that's perhaps what I see of as a positive outcome. Of course, positive for whom? But in terms of actual breakthroughs and understandings of different processes in chip manufacture and design, separating those two things, all the scientists and engineers are here and then the fabrication is done somewhere else, was never a good idea in the short term, has turned out to not be a good idea in the long term. And I think a number of companies are rethinking that, Intel included.
All right, another question. Are there other countries that have adopted your suggested approach, or are they more aligned with the US in terms of basic/applied research?
Wonderful question. I know that the Chinese government wanted to get the book translated. And I think the Japanese state was also interested. Those are the only two places I know of that have, at least at this time, have people at any levels of the state who are interested in the arguments in there. So to be honest with you, I haven't looked recently at what multiple other countries around the world are doing, but I do remember when I was writing the book that taking a look at their stated research policies, it was very clear that a large number of countries are influenced and inspired by US understandings of basic and applied. So I think the big goal would be to sort of shift this understandings in the United States, and there's no doubt that such a shift would have a global impact.
We have one more question. It's a clarification of an earlier question. How is the jargon within research communities affected by the different paradigms?
Yes, jargon affected by the different paradigms. Thanks, Joe. I think, and if I may borrow from what Hunter's saying, which I don't read Hunter's statement as a question, but more as a contribution, I think I would agree with Hunter that the basic research dichotomy is a useful fiction, right? It's too simple, it's exaggerated. The problem or the shame is that it has real impacts and real effects on decisions that are being made about funding, and those decisions that are being made about funding carry with them the need for some sort of oversight function, and the oversight function requires policing to ensure that the funds are being spent appropriately. And this impacts the actual practice of research. So even though I think it is a fiction, it does have real implications and significant implications because it changes the way people do their work. And I think that is really the problem with thinking of it as jargon. I'm disinclined to think of it as jargon. It is jargony in a sense, but the impacts on having folks police themselves or folks being concerned about being audited to ensure that they're in compliance with federal mandates has a real impact on the kind of work they do and they're able to do.
Thank you. So I think you can see Hunter's last comment. I don't know if you want to address it. We are coming up to the top of the hour. It's totally up to you.
Yeah. So Hunter says, what has changed that would make the invention discovery cycle framework more useful than basic versus applied? Yes, I think it's the need for broad-based integrative thinking in solving the problems that are facing us today. I mean, I think and Ernie Moniz said it wonderfully well, that you can't really think about energy solutions without comprehending the entire innovation chain. If one is required to just think about basic research when you're trying to solve battery chemistry problems, and you're not able to line up with folks who may be either building the battery casings or actually building the batteries themselves, and you're unable to talk to them because the auditor prevents you from doing so, then that becomes problematic. And we can think similar issues surrounding climate change and the kinds of technologies and inventions that are going to be necessary to tackle climate change. So I think it's the scope of the problems that are facing us now.
We have two more questions in the written. One counter argument might be that we need a distinction between basic and applied research because basic research is a public good, so it is fair to ask the public to fund it, while applied research is directly connected to making money from the patents on the technology is produced. Isn't there a fairness argument supporting the distinction?
So thank you, David. That's a great question. And I think it speaks to the obduracy of these terms. One of the things that we do in the book is we sort of pay attention to, so how does it actually work in the laboratory? And what you find out very quickly is that either inspiration for asking interesting questions that can lead to new kinds of science and new kinds of discoveries can come just as easily from other kinds of science and other kinds of discoveries as it could come from trying to tackle an important technical problem. So, if you think about the transistor and the invention of the transistor, the problem they were trying to solve was the failure rates of vacuum tubes and how much energy vacuum tubes required and how much heat vacuum tubes produced. And of course, the transistor was a solution for that, but the focus on a practical problem with applicability didn't invalidate the fact that you had a group of researchers at Bell discovering the transistor effect. So it isn't as clear-cut as saying we make money from applied research, we don't make money from basic research. I think that is incorrect. Research can lead to inventions that can turn into money-making devices that people can sell for profit. I think thinking about it as discoveries and inventions enables us to think about ways in which we monetize the products of research and ways in which, since the research was of public benefit and publicly funded, do we want to think about ways to sort of capture that back, or is that just an investment that is seen as a direct investment? But thank you for the question, David.
All right, and our final question today, do you think woke culture has the potential to upset research meritocracy in the name of equity?
That's a great question. So I'm not sure what you mean by woke culture, Joshua, because I mean, you'd have to define that for me, but I do think that the issues of equity are clear and they are present, and I don't see them as inimical to meritocracy. Also, let's say giving grants based on equity and not strictly meritocracy. Well, that's a good clarification. Thank you. So if we think about the ways in which grants are handed out, I don't think anyone would argue that grants should be given based solely on, X number of grants available to this kind of people and X number of grants are not available to this kind of people. I certainly think the meritocracy is still should still be the overriding impetus, but the meritocracy is not meritocratic if there are barriers to participation in the research enterprise. And I think what the recent realizations that not just the United States, but the rest of the world is coming to is making clear is that there are many institutional barriers to full participation by groups of people who should be able to participate. And I'm all for removing those barriers and increasing participation, because I think that just gives us better research.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you, Joshua.
Okay, well, we're about 5 minutes past the hour, so I wanted to take the opportunity to thank everybody who came to this talk today, and also thank you to Dr. Odumosu for a really interesting discussion. We really appreciate your time today. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Suzanne.
And we will make a recording of this talk available through the BPRP website, and I can make it available to Dr. Moon as well and to you too.
Okay. Well, everyone have a wonderful weekend, and thanks for hanging out with me on a Friday afternoon.